The next named storm, Idalia, is looming on the horizon for those of us along the Gulf Coast. Is Florida going to have to batten down the hatches for yet another repeat of an ice storm impact? And who is likely to be most affected? Guys, join me right now. Let's get into those details. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Weather Center Nazario. Today we have some pretty groundbreaking information on potential cyclone Idalia as she begins to make her way from the eastern Pacific into the Atlantic AOR. Overnight models last night and even late into the evening showed a tremendous amount of consistency that this cyclone is expected to form up at the very latest within the next 48 to 72 hours, maybe potentially extending into the 96-hour range depending on how long it takes for her to get her act together once she does enter the Western Caribbean. I'm going to try not to be very long-winded in this video. I simply want to update you with the latest information and start to dig into the nitty-gritty in terms of who needs to be monitoring, who needs to start looking at some very basic preparations, and who could likely be impacted the least and the most as she makes her way towards the Florida Peninsula. Folks, again, if you could do me the sincerest of favors and please like, share, and subscribe, and please click the notification bell if you haven't done so already on my channel. I'm going to be releasing a lot more content as we get closer to ground zero, okay? Once Idalia takes shape, it's going to rapidly come our way. We're looking at as early as Monday of next week, we could start to see the influence of her as she gets closer and closer to the Sunshine State. Now that we've got the introduction out of the way, let's all dig in, fasten our seatbelts. We have a lot to cover today, and I'm going to try to be as fast-paced and understandable as possible. So guys, let's jump in. All right, everyone, thanks for tuning in. Let's get started. We're playing no games today. We're going to start off on the satellite imagery for our AOR, our two potential source regions. I want you all to pay close attention to this cluster of organized convection, that really concentrated amount of water vapor there. That is our entity. That is our future Idalia as she gets ready to cross over Centam and exit into the Western Caribbean AOR. That is going to be our secondary source region. Right now, we are seeing a tremendous amount of moist air convergence as well as moist air influx across this entire area thanks to our upper level low, our TUT that's spinning over the Yucatan Peninsula headed into the Bay of Campeche. We're also seeing some moisture drawn in over northern South America and the remainder of the Caribbean. So everything is converging on this pathway, this tunnel, if you will, that this entity is going to take as it moves north into our Atlantic AOR. There's plenty of moisture and relative humidity available. Dry air is not going to be a factor. I'm going to rule that out early in the video. Dry air is not going to play a role in this system's development. There may be a little bit of wind shear, but dry air, especially during the first couple days this thing is out over open water, is going to be nil to none thanks to the thunderstorm activity kicking off near our TUT low over Cuba, over the Yucatans, just to the north of where it is expected to take shape, as well as the moisture continuing to draw itself in over extensions of Colombia and parts of Centam to its east. We also have Franklin still spinning off. If you look, the upper air pattern is taking a little bit of the tropical energy from Franklin and kind of rotating it back around an anticyclonic faction towards our potential Idalia. So there's a lot of influence being placed on this system. We already have an organized center of circulation indicated on windy.com. There is a closed low that stacks upwards of almost to 500 millibars. It's clearly evident from the surface to 925, 850, 700, and we're starting to see reflections of it all the way up to 500 millibars. So we already have some spinach associated with it. It's just a matter of how it's going to look once it comes across the terrain, gets back over those really, really hot sea surface temperatures and those exponentially hotter ocean heat content across much of the Caribbean and across much of the eastern Gulf of Mexico. That's what's going to make this very interesting. That's the reason I really want to highlight this feature as she begins to work her way off to the north, okay? We're going to continue going right along. Guys, these are going to be the ensembles with the Euro. I want to bring these up because we've been seeing some interesting trends over the last 24 hours. There has been a general consensus. The Big Bend area of Florida is going to have to pay close attention to this, and I will show you as of 0Z this morning, early this morning, we had very, very good member agreement. You can see how concentrated they are. How concentrated they are headed in towards the Big Bend, Tallahassee area with about maybe a great tropical storm, if not a low-grade Cat 1 hurricane working its way in there. Things are looking a bit more ominous as of now, looking at the 6 Zulu. 6Z only goes out about 144 hours. However, I'm going to go right to the tail end of the run. As you can see, we're starting to see a bit more of an eastward jog, and some of the members are indicating a little bit more strengthening. We're looking at the red category up here in the legend. If you can see it in the top right portion of the screen, I have it underlined between 960 to 979 millibar central pressure. That's pushing Cat 2. maybe even Cat 3, depending on how much this girl wants to tap into the really, really hot Gulf of Mexico waters and how much the shear plays a role on its development as it gets closer and closer to landfall, okay? We're going to transition very quickly. We're going to go to our probabilities. These probabilities, especially for a depression early on in the run, are off the charts. At 96 hours and even at 72 hours, working its way through the Caribbean up towards the channel between Cuba and the Yucatan, you can see there's a nice little pocket of 85 to 90% chance, guys, that we're going to have something over the next 3 to 4 days. I would not be surprised if Hurricane Center continues to up their percentages in terms of favorability of development not only in 48 hours but over the next 7 days. You can see this as well on the tropical storm probabilities. As you go down the road and we get closer and closer to Florida, we're starting to see the amounts go up. These are the highest they've been over the last few days, reaching a maximum of between 35 to 40% that we're going to see a tropical storm coming to shore somewhere over the panhandle of Florida. Now the big kicker is how far to the west or how far to the east is this system going to wobble, especially with the factors I'm going to get into here momentarily. We're going to take a closer look at ensemble members, guys. This is still 0Z. This is the longer run from overnight, the more accurate run. To an extent, this is one of our hot analysis runs where we have live data coinciding with the model, and I want to show you the general consensus that we are still looking at a possible panhandle landfall with a little bit of wobbling to the east depending on how potent our steering factors off over CONUS can get. I'll go ahead and switch over to the 06Z. You'll get a closer look at what I was talking about earlier with that eastward fetch. Here's 90 hours, 96 hours out, 4 days from now. You can see that already the general consensus has shifted from the channel between the peninsula and Cuba over to western Cuba. This is looking very familiar. If you guys remember my video from the other day, this looks very familiar. We've seen a lot of major hurricanes, particularly in the name I, or naming start with I, coming across western Cuba, okay? Some people are mentioning that we could see some weakening because of this. Take that minimally. There will be some land interaction, yes, but however, Cuba is not as mountainous as most people will lead you to believe, and especially if this system is expected to gain some forward momentum and not necessarily be racing off to the north-northeast, but moving at a greater rate than we saw in the likes of Ian last year, we might not see any kind of disintegration of this system in the low levels thanks to that land interaction. Going forward through time, we're going forward. You can see that now the European model is highlighting a potential tropical storm, if not Cat 1 hurricane over interior parts of the Florida Peninsula. Panhandle is still under the gun, but folks, if I had to draw an area that I need you monitoring, Brian Shields echoed this as well earlier this morning. Anywhere from the Big Bend area all the way down through where you guys had Ian come through last year, Fort Myers, Naples, Southwest Florida. We all need to kind of be monitoring. We all need to be watching. We haven't seen anything take shape yet. The circulation itself is still in the East Pacific. East Pac hasn't gone over Centam yet, but this has been trending for the last number of days. Okay, we're going to go ahead and look at the icon. The icon has been calling for a South and Central Florida impact for the last 2 days now. This is going to be 850 millibar winds. This is the most up-to-date information we have. This is 12Z. You can see we start to see some cyclogenesis take place at the very bottom of the screen. We have that cyclonic turning in the winds, indicative of our cyclone finally starting to unveil herself as she begins to make her way off to the north and eventually the north-northeast. And as you can see, as we start to deepen this system, however ragged and distorted, you can see it's very east side loaded because of the wind shear that we are anticipating may play a role in its development and how strong or how much strengthening we see as it progresses towards landfall. You can see that the icon still wants to bring it in. I hate to say it. It's been trending like this for 24 hours now. The same general area that we saw Hurricane Charlie in 2004, that we are very, very familiar with the impacts of Hurricane Ian, major Hurricane Ian last year, come ashore in southwest Florida. I'll go ahead and draw a giant black circle around it. You all need to be paying attention. You're under the gun as well. You are on my radar. The Panhandle all the way down to that same general ground zero area that felt the impacts of Ian last year are all on the radar. We need to be watching, okay? Switching over to the CMC has been consistent, very consistent, and has actually been highlighting this system for 9 days now. It's been on track with calling for cyclogenesis occurring in the eastern portions of the Pacific, working their way over Central America into the West Caribbean and deepening from there and headed towards us. I will say there has been a bit more variability this morning in what the CMC is anticipating. We're looking at a possible westward path into the Yucatan Peninsula, maybe even preventing it from deepening as much as we've seen on previous model runs before it begins to make that east-northeast track towards the state of Florida. However, as you can see, it begins to deepen rapidly, still east side loaded because of the wind shear, and it suddenly takes a bit more of a northerly fetch back towards that Big Bend area of Florida, very reminiscent of what the Euro was calling for last night and what the Euro has been trending for. So the CMC has been trending for a central Florida landfall, and it hasn't made any major adjustments until just now. That's why I wanted to wait until 12 Zulu data came in so I can give you the most latest information, especially with as dramatic of a change as this is. Guys, with it being potentially east side loaded, if that wind shear can play a major role in the life cycle and development of the system, the further west it goes from central Florida, the more impacts we'll actually see from it because of the structuring of the storm, thanks to the shear that we're expecting coming out of the west. I'll get to that here in a moment. We'll talk a little bit more detail. We'll get a little into the intricacies as we get further into the video. All right, next up, we got to talk steering flow. We're looking at 500 millibars. We're still talking about our subtropical ridge, our high height center responsible for a record-breaking heat wave across much of interior cone is being felt far and wide. Everyone is under the gun. We've seen a lot of unfortunate heat-related deaths over the last couple weeks now, and it's going to continue, unfortunately. However, over time, that ridge is still forecast to transition off to the west and position itself and become more sharp amplitude in nature. I bring this up. The more amplitude we have in our ridges, the slower these long wave features begin to behave. They begin to move at a slower pace because they are higher in amplitude. They're not racing along with the 200-300 millibar jet flow up in the upper levels of the atmosphere. So the higher this ridge builds, the stronger our trough will get over the eastern United States. You can see the trough axis digging southward across the Great Lakes through the Ohio-Mississippi Valley, orienting itself right up against the Appalachian Mountain Basin into the Gulf of Mexico. Down here at 500 millibars, you can see what looks to resemble Idalia finally taking shape just off the Florida west coast. Here's Franklin out here, who I do believe, if he continues to deepen and become a potential major hurricane, as some of the latest model runs are indicating, I think Franklin may actually play a role in pulling Idalia a little, just a little off to the east, because we're going to see a lot more of that cyclonic turning, deepening lower pressure. We're going to have more steering flow tugging our systems off to the east, drawing moisture, drawing energy towards Franklin as he continues to try to deepen into a catastrophic hurricane. The primary takeaway from this, despite all of my fancy jargon, is the slower yet deeper this trough axis gets, it's number one going to affect the timing of how much influence it plays on potential cyclone Idalia as she gets closer to Florida, as well as how much more of an eastward pull this feature is going to have. WPC is now predicting that our cold front that was once anticipated to undergo frontalysis to weaken over the Gulf Coast states is now anticipated to make it a bit further south. So I think we may continue to see a bit more refining of the Euro and the CMC's model paths in terms of shifting it just a hair off to the east, okay? So lots of different variables to pay attention to. These upper level features are going to be primarily responsible for what we see this system do. You can even see at 500 millibars already at 0Z, in the upper levels anyways, the reflection of it comes on a little bit further east than what we were anticipating previously, at least according to the Euro. So lots of things to pay attention to, lots of timing and extrapolating on my part and other meteorologist parts as well to provide you guys with the most accurate information, okay? Now we're going to shift gears. We're going to talk shear, okay? Shear is going to play a role in Idalia's life cycle, okay? The reason being is we have some shear in the area as we speak. That shear is anticipated to evacuate. However, I'm going to stop the clock here 2 days from now. This is 48 hours out. I'm going to change the coloring of my pen so hopefully you can see it a little bit better. There are some streamlines up here turning in a cyclonic fashion. What this tells me is that there is a potential upper low and a shortwave trough in the upper levels of the atmosphere between 500 and 300 millibars that is expected to sink southward into our Gulf of Mexico. As we have winds and jet energy wrapping around that system, we'll go forward in time, we'll start going ahead. That is going to increase that westerly shear component for our tropical cyclone Idalia. As you can see, she is now centered here at 998 millibar tropical cyclone, potential tropical storm approaching hurricane strength, depending on how much she can tap into those sea surface temperatures, ocean heat content, how much this wind shear actually does pan out. But you can see that westerly wind shear component wrapping around the base of our low height center centered over the central western Gulf of Mexico. So that's going to be the number one feature we have to watch out for. Dry air is going to be nil to none. There really isn't going to be anything suppressing it or slowing it down as we saw with Franklin making that abrupt turn after almost going stationary in the central Caribbean. There is a due north track anticipated. National Hurricane Center is picking up on that. It's really going to be determined as how much shear we get to realize from this upper low, and again, the timing. The timing is going to be critical. If we see this low sink down faster before Idalia can work her way up to the north, that's going to be an issue. It may leave us with less shear. It may become a bit more organized and deepen and head a little bit more to the north as a stronger hurricane. If it comes down as anticipated, we may see a more easterly loaded storm. Central Florida is going to see a lot more winds and precip associated with this. Folks in the Panhandle may not see as much at all because of the shear playing a role in how that storm symmetry takes shape, okay? Finally, I know that was a long-winded spiel. Let's go on. We're going to get a little more detailed now, okay? This is where I want to start to highlight potential impacts. So we're zoomed in up close to the Florida Peninsula. I have the Panhandle and Central South Florida in view. Right now what we're looking at is maximum forecasted wind gusts with the current state of the forecast track according to the Euro, okay? We'll go out towards the very back end of the run, 144 hours out. This is Wednesday. I will say that with a grain of salt. Wednesday at 0Z does not mean Wednesday early morning or Wednesday night. 0 Zulu universal time is offset by approximately 7 hours. So if I were to do the math, this is actually Tuesday at approximately 8 p.m. So unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, I hate to say it, I personally, as much as I am a fan of this interesting weather phenomena, this severe weather phenomena, I'm not a fan of evening storms. Because as this storm becomes closer and closer, whether or not it develops into a substantial hurricane, remains as a tropical storm, especially with that shear playing a role on it, we're still going to see impacts. We're going to see feeder bands rolling through from south up to northern Florida. That's going to increase the localized flooding threat. It's going to increase convective wind threats with embedded cells within the storm that could possibly downrush winds down to the surface, increasing surface winds, very reminiscent of tropical storm force winds. And let's not forget tornadoes. Anytime we have a hurricane or any kind of tropical feature coming in close to the overnight hours, we run the risk of seeing overnight dark tornadoes. And that's when things begin to get a little scary. I want to keep you guys up to date and ahead of this as much as I can. As we go forward through the loop, you can see as she begins to make her eastward trek across the state of Florida. Along the coast, we could see anywhere between 55 to 65 knots of wind. These are gusts. This is anticipating a strong tropical storm, maybe low-grade hurricane. Interior parts of northern Florida, we're talking just to the north of the greater metro area of Orlando, getting up close to Ocala, the Daytona Beach area. In eastern Florida, we could still see well above tropical storm force winds as she races off to the north and eventually the north-northeast. So these are going to change. I expect some variability in this track. I'm really looking forward to 12 Zulu today. I may come out with another video here very soon because I have a very strong gut feeling that the track sits somewhere in this area now. I have a feeling we're going to slowly see a bit, just a bit of a wobble off to the east, and this is going to change things for everybody in the state of Florida. Moving along, we're going to go to the precip now. The precip's going to play a big role with Ian last year, as a matter of fact. The coast saw the brunt of his wind and storm surge. In this case, the rainfall, regardless of the intensity of this storm, is still going to be one of the number one factors. So as we go forward in time and we begin to see Idalia take shape and come towards the state of Florida, these rainfall totals are likely to go up. This is anticipating a more symmetrical storm. You can see the center of circulation in here with the heaviest precip wrapping around really well. And we have the southerly winds drawing precip into the southwestern coastline. Everyone's going to feel the effects of it. The precip bands are going to probably expand off to the east if that shear plays a big role, and dependent upon how far west and how far east this system tracks. Those of you in the Panhandle who are tuning into this video, as you can see, I'll go towards the very end of this run as she begins to make her way across northern Florida. Because of that wind shear, Panhandle is pretty much going to be void of any kind of significant activity. This is likely induced by our frontal system coming down. That's also going to play a role on how much of an eastward or westward track this system takes. These rainfall totals are likely an indication that our front is going to be somewhere working its way through the Panama City, Pensacola area as she begins to make landfall and work her way through Tallahassee up towards Jacksonville and eventually eventually back off the coast over those Gulf Stream waters where she could possibly re-intensify. Okay, guys, I wanted to make this short and sweet. We are now approaching the 19-minute mark, so we're going to go ahead and conclude. We're doing Weather Center Nazario today a little backwards. We're going to finish with National Hurricane Center's homepage. As you can see, we have our area of interest all the way up to 50% chance. This is the fastest I've seen a system ramp up, at least as far as this hurricane season is concerned. Some of the disturbances we've seen in the MDR did end up going up pretty quickly, but within the last 12 hours, we went from a 20% chance to a 50% chance, and within the next 45 minutes, I anticipate we may see these odds go up as we get more model data. So, folks, those of you watching Yucatan, you need to be watching very extreme eastern Mexico, parts of western Cuba, those in Jamaica even, depending on how far of an eastern wobble we see before she gets into the Gulf of Mexico. Need to be paying attention to how much the bands begin to interact with your landmass as well. I don't anticipate a tremendous amount of influence, but we could see some swells, some increased surf, depending on how deep this system gets before exiting into the Gulf of Mexico. Because remember, I'm going to go back to my Epic pen one last time, highlighted in red. We have a tremendous amount of hot boiling water, figurative boiling water, not literally boiling water, folks, but boiling water all through the Gulf of Mexico and deep heated water over the central and western Caribbean. So there's a lot of surface energy and subsurface energy that this storm can tap into, especially before getting into the Gulf and dealing with that shear. There is an extremely favorable environment from the MGO oscillation all the way down to just the finite details of the hot waters, that moisture convergence we were talking about at the beginning of this video, that could deepen this system faster than the models are anticipating. We've seen it time and time again. National Hurricane Center will start off forecasting a depression tropical storm. We saw it with Ian last year, very reminiscent of what Idalia could potentially do. In terms of track, not intensity, in terms of track, we saw him deepen from a 115 mile per hour Cat 3 into a catastrophic Cat 5 in the span of about 6 to 8 hours. So, am I raising the alarm? Not yet. She hasn't come to reality just yet. Am I trying to raise awareness? Absolutely. Florida, we need to be paying attention. I'm starting to lose faith that areas in Louisiana, Mississippi, and maybe even the southern tip of Alabama could see some influence on the storm. I'm beginning to lose that confidence. I really think this is the one for Florida. We're definitely going to have to batten down the hatches. Once again, we may see a Cat 1, Cat 2 eye storm working her way through here. Well, folks, with all that being said, this has been a very energized Weather Center Nazario episode. Let's go ahead and start concluding. I said it a couple days ago, and I'm going to say it again, despite whoever may be telling you that may or may not be the case. Idalia is on the horizon. She is looming on the horizon, and I do anticipate we're going to see development over the next 3 days or so, especially as we get through the back end of this weekend. Thank you all for watching today. Floridians, it's time for us to start at least taking a look at our preparedness plans, start looking at filling up your gas tanks, especially if and when a state of emergency is announced. If she does get her act together and form into a hurricane, we know how that can induce a panic. I'm not trying to fearmonger. I'm not trying to strike any kind of fear into those of you watching. I'm simply trying to raise an alert that we've seen this before. It's kind of like clockwork. We get a Western Caribbean system working its way up with the dynamics in place, and Florida is inevitably in the target. It is in the bullseye, the red zone as we like to call it. So with that being said, folks, thank you very much for tuning in to this latest episode of Weather Center Nazario. Things are starting to trend in the exciting realm. I'm going to keep you guys updated and get way more vigorous and rambunctious with the content I pump out so you guys can stay ahead of the storm like myself and others involved. Please stay safe. Take a look at the few things I mentioned. Rewatch this video to get a further grasp on it if you decide to. But again, this is Weather Center Nazario, signing out.